Buonasera, benvenuti alla Casa Italiana Zerilli-Marimò di New York University. It's a great pleasure to welcome you back here for the Giornata della Memoria. As you know, in New York we have these, by now, long-established tradition of following the directive of the European Union that was also received as a law by the Italian Parliament to celebrate January 27th as the day of the liberation of Auschwitz from Nazis, and we do this as a community, and we do this with the other Italian and Italian-American institutions in New York, the Italian Consulate General, the Italian Institute of Culture, the Italian Academy for Advanced Studies at Toronto University, and the Calandra Italian-American Institute at Queen College. It is very important for us to get together as Italians to remember those events, and in case there is some doubt why every year you do something, because you know you hear also these kind of things. I just want to invite you to take a look at the speech that the President of the Italian Republic gave on the occasion of the Day of Memory, and in which basically it's the last time that he, as President of the Republic, President Napolitano, presides over these celebrations, and it's a day that is particularly dear to him. He has put a lot of emphasis on education, the participation of schools and universities in these events. And he says that it's very, very important to vigilare. Vigilare, be vigil, be alert against any kind of revisionism of history. And whenever you think that is no longer a danger, it's right there. Therefore, our choice with our friends of the Centro Primo Levi that are sponsoring and organizing this evening is to remember correctly from an historical point of view, and remember bravely. And that's what we do in this day of memory. And without further ado, I would like to ask Natalia Indrimi, who is the director of the Centro Primo Levi, to come up to the podium and tell you something about this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefano. I'd like to thank Stefano Albertini and Casa Italiana Zerilli-Marimò for having been such a wonderful partner for many years in the presentation of this program and many other programs on many topics of Italian history, Italian Jewish history. I'd also like to thank the Consulate General of Italy, that is here represented by Vice Consul Dino Sorrentino, the Italian Cultural Institute, the Calandra Italian-American Institute at CUNY, and the Italian Academy at Columbia University. Tonight we present a new collective work on the history of the Shoah in Italy. It has been published last year by the UTET in Turin, and is curated by 4 prominent Italian historians. Enzo Traverso, who, by the way, tonight should have been here, but unfortunately he has been caught up in an event at Cornell, and he sends his apology, and he will be present at one of our next events. Simone Levi-Sullam, Marianne Bonocci, and Marcello Flores. The book contains articles, essays by over 20 historians, many of whom have been on this stage and at the programs of Centro Primo Levi. And it is particularly relevant for this presentation and for the series that we've been presenting. And why? First of all, I should say, if, as we hope, it will be translated into English, it will represent the 3rd major in-depth overview on the history of the Italian Shoah that has been made available to the English readership. The first being Renzo De Felice, the second, Michele Sarfati's Jews in Mussolini's Italy, and hopefully this one, which explores from different perspectives and in an intergenerational way, from a historiographical point of view, the history of fascist Italy in which the persecution of the Jews occurred. Through the years, we've been trying to expand the public discourse on the persecution of Italian Jews to the broader context in which it took place. The rise and fall of the fascist regime led by Benito Mussolini from 1922 until its removal from office and arrest in 1933, its liberation by the Germans, and throughout his last disastrous rule over the Italian Social Republic, which, with a German ally, occupied the northern half of Italy until its final defeat by the Anglo-American allies in April 1945. These 23 years of fascist rule drastically changed the course of the history of Italy as a young nation. Starting in 1924, with the murder of opposition leader Giacomo Matteotti, Italians progressively learned how to live under a police state. No free press, no freedom of speech, no political debates, no civil liberties. And they were constantly under the frightening spell of what historians have been able to document as a widespread network of civilian informers. Political internment, torture, state murder, contempt for international agreements, violation of human rights were the base of this power. Those few who did not abide were forced to leave the country. By the end of its first decade, the dictatorship had more than 25,000 political prisoners. Almost 3 generations were born during this period and did not know anything else but fascism. And this included the Jewish minority, which, according to the census of 1938, counted roughly 43,000 individuals. Now, these 23 years are the history in which the persecution against the Jews and a broad range of things that today we consider crime, but that we consider crime at that time as well, happened. And yet, while preparing these few weeks of programming, every year we are confronted with a narrow selection of issues. How come Italy, where anti-Semitism had never existed, all of a sudden promulgated the racial laws? And after all, how efficiently were they really implemented? And didn't 80% of Italian Jews survive, protected by Italians, and with the blessing of the government, the army, and the church? These are the questions that arrive to us every year. Program proposals, books, articles, and the questions that in which the entire debate on fascism is synthesized every single year. Now, Italian historians and international historians have engaged with these questions for many years and have debated them, had found answers, had made arguments. However, at this point, with research that, the type of research that is represented in a book like the one we present tonight, I think it's no longer possible to reduce the entire history of fascism to this lens of how good or how bad fascism was toward the Jews. How is it possible that 20 years of the history of a nation be condensed in popular consciousness of these few questions, as if the extermination of the Jews happened in the vacuum and by the sole responsibility of Mussolini's alliance with Adolf Hitler? this reduction, these three questions, these three issues that are continuously raised, even in this room by our public, represent a way to reduce the entire issue of Italian self-representation and collective awareness of its fascist past to the apparently yet frightening accounting of how many Jews were saved and how many Jews were killed. This book, in which a trove of recent and not so recent research is collected to reconstruct the specific Italian way in which the Italian brand of anti-Semitism became murderous, is a very important tool to extricate ourselves from a debate on good and evil, a debate on good Italians, bad Germans, so-so French, which at this point, 75 years after the racial laws, closes our horizons and reduces our intellectual outlook. I'm extremely grateful to the 4 editors of this book and to the many, many contributors who made available their research through this anthology. And to our speakers, who tonight, at least 2 of them, traveled from afar to come and present this important work. I will present our speakers, and I will start from ladies, because we are old-fashioned. and then I will invite them to present, to give us an overview of what the book is and how it impacts the historiography that is available to us on the Shoah in Italy and on the history of fascism. Our speakers tonight are Susan Zuccotti, Franklin Adler, and Federico Finchelstein. Susan Zuccotti received her PhD in Modern European History from Columbia University. She's the author of The Italians and the Holocaust, Persecution, Rescue, and Survival, Holocaust, the French, and the Jews, and under his very windows, the Vatican and the Holocaust in Italy. She wrote many other books, but I chose this for her presentation. Her first book received the National Jewish Book Award for Holocaust Study in the United States. Dr. Zuccotti has taught Holocaust and General Western European History at Columbia and Barnard College. The new biography of Père-Marie Benoit, a French Capuchin priest working closely with Jewish friends and associates, rescues thousands of Jews in Marseille and Rome during the Holocaust, will be published in the spring of 2013. Franklin Adler specializes in political and social theory and comparative politics in Europe. He's the author of Italian Industrialism from Liberalism to Fascism, which traces the development of industrial association in Italy from 1906 to 1934 and challenges traditional interpretations of the rise of fascism. He's been working on a major manuscript on thinking beyond anti-racism, as well as on projects on the European radical right and issues in the liberal communitarian debate. Federico Finchelstein is Associate Professor of History at the New School for Social Research. He has taught at the History Department of Brown University and received his PhD at Cornell University. Professor Finchelstein is the author of 4 books on fascism, the Holocaust and Jewish history in Latin America and Europe. His last book, Transatlantic Fascism, studies the global connection between Italian and Argentine fascism. He has published more than 50 academic articles and reviews on fascism, Latin American populism, and genocide and anti-Semitism. Professor Adler has written a very extensive review of this work, of the anthology we present tonight, which appeared in Quest, the online journal of the Center for Contemporary Jewish Documentation in Milan, which is online, and I invite everybody to browse through it. And we have invited him because he has an in-depth understanding of how the work was assembled and what it means within the current historiography. I would like to invite Professor Adler to join us on the stage. And Federico Finchelstein is also deeply acquainted with the authors and many of the authors and the material of this book. His research has had many interactions with that of the historians who are contributors to the anthology, and I like to call him to the stage as well. We'll function in a way, in a round table format. And Susan Zuccotti is one of the contributors to the anthology. And please, Susan. I also like to welcome Roberta Ascarelli, professor of German literature at the University of Siena, who is also a contributor to the work. We didn't know she would be here, and we're very happy that she's a visiting professor at Rochester University until May, and she will join us in the discussion. Now, I would like to start with Professor Adler, who will give us a first overview of the book anthology and its structure. Is it correct? Please welcome Professor Adler.
I'm not quite sure what I'm going to do, because originally I was going to be a respondent, and that role changed.
Well, now you're the...
And now I'm going to be saying something. I'm not going to say too much about the two volumes, because I wrote a rather long review essay, and my thoughts are probably best expressed there. What I will say, just to add a little bit, is I think the major virtue of this collection is it puts together in one place an accumulation of research that puts the lie to what one still hears in Italy sometime, that the racial laws weren't very serious, they were there to satisfy the Germans, and so forth. The new literature on the Jews really began in the late 1980s, the 50th anniversary of the racial laws. And that's when Macalester, who became really the dean of every one of us who works on this, began to challenge this. I mean, he demonstrates that these laws were rigorously administered, probably more so than any other laws in Italian history, quick and thorough. And so in one place, all of the cards, as I said in the review, are on the table. So now it's really no longer a debate whether or not the anti-Semitic campaign was serious. It was, and we know practically everything. What I thought I would do today is to say something about the particularities of the Italian case. I've been involved in Holocaust research for more than 20 years, and it's only in recent times that I was able to push through a panel that dealt with Italy. Macalester was here along with some fine younger Italian scholars. One of the reasons is that the Italian case just doesn't fit into the master narrative of the Holocaust. It's different, in part because I think the German case simply occupies too much conceptual space, as if everything that happened to Jews in Europe during the 1930s were part of some master Nazi narrative, and there weren't local problems having to do with Jews that might have been just as important. As most of you know, anti-Semitism was not part of the formative principles of Italian fascism. It wasn't part of its ideology. There were Jews who had important positions in the party, in the universities, and in government. It's also interesting, if we go back to 1934, the initial reaction on the part of Mussolini and other Italian intellectuals like Giuseppe Bottai was rather dismissive of Nazi racism. In a meeting that Mussolini had with the Universale group, a group of young fascist intellectuals from Florence, he praised them for having attacked Nazi racism that he referred to as roba di biondi, which, since I'm a vulgar New Yorker, I would translate as blonde bullshit, but means sort of blonde stuff. It doesn't make too much sense. Now, getting back to this master narrative, if we look at the work of George Moser, very, very important German historian who taught for many years at University of Wisconsin, he argued that what happened in the 1930s in Europe was largely a redeployment of movements and themes which already surfaced in the late 19th century. I think this view works for Austria, works for Germany, works for France. It doesn't work particularly well for Italy. Of course, no Christian nation in Europe was free of anti-Semitism, but unlike France and Italy, there were no anti-Semitic leagues, no Dreyfus affair, nor a literary establishment that was largely anti-Semitic. Unlike Austria, there was no self-professed mayor of Vienna, Karl Lueger, anti-Semite, self-professed anti-Semite. It's interesting that the very time Lueger was mayor of Vienna, anti-Semite, the mayor of Rome was a Jew, Ernesto Nathan. Unlike Germany, in Italy, there were no protracted debates concerning Jewish emancipation. Unlike Russia, no pogroms. These were largely absent in Italy, whose small Jewish population was so assimilated that it had the highest rate of intermarriage of any Jewish community in Europe, roughly 30%. Add to that the fact that at the outbreak of World War I, Italy, alone in Europe, already had had 3 prime ministers of Jewish origin. Everyone points to France. Leon Blum, head of the Popular Front. Italy had 3 prime ministers of Jewish origin before World War I. And thus it would be difficult to argue that prior anti-Semitic history is an exploratory variable to account for the fascist campaign in Italy against Jews in 1938. In fact, for me, what makes the Italian case so interesting in a comparative sense is the relative absence of these factors identified with anti-Semitism in Central, Western, and Eastern Europe. In Italy, there really wasn't a large group of Ostjuden. What was problematic in Vienna, Berlin, Paris, is the migration of Jews from Eastern Europe to points west. And we know that in Vienna, and Berlin, and Paris, that became a problem, these foreign Jews. Italy, there weren't any. In Italy, the Jews didn't form a separate linguistic group, as they did, for example, in Poland, where they spoke Yiddish, and if they spoke Polish, it was with a Yiddish accent. I would suggest that the abrupt turn toward anti-Semitism in Italy was a break. Now, this is a debate among historians. One of the essays, Alaria Pavan, debate among historians, and I'm identified with the group that says this represents discontinuity. Macalester and some of the others are part of this group and saying, no, it's part of growing anti-Semitism. Unlike the German case, where anti-Semitism, as I said, was formative, In Italy, it happens during the 16th year of Mussolini's stay in power. So it occurred relatively late. And it's interesting that those most directly responsible for implementing anti-Semitic policy were not anti-Semites in the same sense that we could claim the Nazis were anti-Semites. It's interesting that in Germany, higher echelon Nazis prided themselves that they never even shook hands with a Jew. Well, let's consider Mussolini, that had, so far as we know, at least 3 Jewish mistresses. So he did more than shake hands, clearly. His daughter Edda, who maybe had inherited his horniness, was engaged to a Jew. Mussolini broke that engagement after the Lateran agreements were signed. She then married Count Giano, a notorious philanderer, like Mussolini, who also had numerous Jewish mistresses. In other words, in Italy, unlike Germany, there wasn't this hygienic sphere where Jews were the debased others. Giuseppe Bottai was Minister of Public Education at the time of the racial laws and would expel Jewish students and professors from schools the academic year starting in the fall of 1938. Just 5 years earlier, Bottai had joined the famous philosopher Giovanni Gentile in helping establish on Italian soil private schools for German Jewish children whose educational opportunities now were difficult in Germany. Though in 1938, Bottai stated that schools so central to the transmission of fascist values and Italian identity had to be defended and protected from any Jewish presence, he himself had many Jewish friends from the time that he was a student at the famous Liceo Classico Tasso in Rome. Apparently none of them infected him with the distinctively alien, nomadic, degenerate influences he later attributed to Jews. Jewish friendships also marked, again without apparent injury, Bottai's days as a futurist. In fact, the other co-founder of Bottai's influential journal, Critica Fascista, Gino Modigliani, was a Jew, as were some of his best friends and collaborators in Critica Fascista, Enrico Rocca, Gino Arias. So Bottai is an interesting case to deal with. He certainly never had an anti-Semitic period prior to 1938. Similarly, Alessandro Pavolini, who would become the influential Minister of Popular Culture during 1939, when the racial laws would be rigorously instituted. Let's look at Pavolini's background. He had been partially raised by a Jewish couple when his father, a famous professor of Sanskrit at the University of Florence, ran off with a Finnish woman half his age. As a teenager in Florence, Pavolini was friendly with Carlo Agnello Rossellini. What did I say?
Rossellini.
Oh, Rosselli. Sorry. Jewish brothers who, of course, would go on to be famous anti-fascist intellectuals murdered in France in June of 1939. Pavolini's brother, Corrado, a fascist writer of some note, was actually married to a Jew, all the time that Pavolini was instituting policies against Jews. During the first years of Nazi rule, Rome had become a haven for prominent German Jews. When George Morse's family arrived in Rome, a bouquet of flowers for his mother greeted them at their hotel. sent by no less than Mussolini. Now, it's hard to imagine Hitler sending a bouquet of flowers to Frau Morse. Mussolini, of course, knew that Morse's father was a powerful publishing magnate in Germany. In 1934, some of the ironies of history, Mussolini founded a Center for Experimental Film with money from the League of Nations, of all things. And he brought to Italy Rudolph Arnhem, who was a German Jewish authority on cinema, to teach at this center. There it was Arnhem who taught a whole young generation of filmmakers, later to become famous as neorealists after the war. He published in the journal Cinema, edited by Mussolini's son Vittorio. Arnhem was not alone. Soon he was joined by other famous German Jewish notables, such as Walter Benjamin, Max Reinhardt, Max Neufeld, and Max Ophüls. Actually, Ophüls' film, La Signora di Tutti, was nominated for the best film in the 1934 Venice Film Festival. It won the Mussolini Cup. And it was Italy's official entry, right? Again, this is 1934, 4 years before the racial legislation. Also nominated among the 7 finalists for the Mussolini Cup were films by 2 other Jews, George Cukor, the US entry for Little Women, and Alexander Korda, the British entry for The Private Lives of Don Juan. In 1934, Max Reinhardt in Italy produced Midsummer's Night Dream in Florence, and in 1934, The Merchant of Venice in Venice. Max Neufeld, who gained fame as a Jewish actor in Austria, then went to Berlin, became a director, left Berlin for Rome due to the Nazi racial legislation. Because he was able to secure documentation that his mother was Catholic, he was able to make films throughout the duration of the fascist period, right into the 1950s with stars like Anna Magnani. One of the most fascinating things, I just mentioned this earlier, Italian film historians note in Cinema, November of 1938, for the first time, there's an anti-Semitic denunciation by Vittorio Mussolini of American Jews who were dominating the world through Hollywood. There had never been anything in Cinema. It was said that cinema was a privileged art form, and Mussolini made sure that it was shielded from some of this stuff, right? So on one side of the page, there's this editorial. On the other side of the page, and no one points this out, is a full-page ad for a new movie called Mille Lire al Mese, made by Max Neufeld. And this is what set me on. Growing up in New York, I never met a Neufeld or a Neufeld that wasn't Jewish. I said, this is crazy. One side of the page denouncing Jews in cinema, the other side, an ad for this great new film made by a Jew. I would say, when we look at the 1930s, we have to cast aside some type of teleological view. This is a problem that I have with the historians who would explain the racial legislation as progressive anti-Semitism. In fact, if we look at culture, there was a tremendous opening. Marla Stone has a wonderful book published by Princeton University Press, The Patron State. There was no period in Italian history where money was pumped into the arts as during the 1930s, and with no strings attached. Unlike the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, that had lines that had to be followed. In Italy, there were traditionalists slugging that out with modernists. And if you know anything about Mussolini's modus operandi, that's exactly what he wanted, because everyone had to come to him in order to settle disputes. Mussolini only wanted to make sure that intellectuals were on board. That would change after 1938, that type of openness. If we look at the generation of prominent Italian intellectuals after the war, the so-called second generation, the generation of Mussolini, including my mentor, Roberto Bobbio. Practically all of them had been active in the GUF, Fascist University Youth. Many of them had won the annual competitions, the Litoriale. Jews participated in this. Okay. Why did they do this? These were young intellectuals, ambitious. And they were willing to play the game. The incentives were there. Bassani, for example, was active in the Litoriale. After 1938, that changed, because intellectuals were then expected to demonize Jews. So continued collaboration took on a much more sinister effect in 1938. The last point that I want to make is that we're now, for the first time, dealing with this generation of young fascist intellectuals, not in terms like outing someone in Germany like Günter Grass. Bobbio was outed, other people were outed, but a virtue of a book by Marilla Seri called Irredenti, The Redeemed, is the fact that she deals with an entire generation. Most of them continued collaboration. A new book came out in Italy 2 years ago, Secret Funds Dispersed by Mussolini. Most of the intellectuals got a monthly stipend over and above what else they did. Mascagni was the worst. Of course, he was a famous conductor. Mussolini couldn't stand him, hitting for money all the time. Give him what he wants, but I don't want to deal with him myself. In the few cases that intellectuals criticized the racial policy, they were cut off immediately. So 38 does represent a break, but my point here is we have to better understand the first half of the 1930s also.
Something that, thank you, Professor Adler, for this presentation. Something that this book does, and maybe the other crowd of historians who see a growing history of anti-Semitism in Italy, is to document the bureaucratic process that, in many cases, we know that the first set of census of Jewish intellectuals, Jewish academics, Jewish scientists goes back to 1934. The first large and comprehensive census of the Jews of Italy that suddenly are forced to be organized under the control of the Ministry of the Interior dates 1931. And I think the interest of this new historiography is exactly to see how, parallel to the relatively, open front line that you described, and besides, we have historians have found offices and offices of censored material, censored film, censored books from those years, from the first decade of the fascist regime. So not everything really came out so freely. So the issue is, how did this other line of bureaucratic anti-Semitism, of changing of the Italian institutions, of strategic moving of main figures in the scientific field, in the university field, from place to another. I mean, the removal of Ettore Levi from the Institute of Genetics is a famous case in this respect. So that type of very methodic change of the bureaucracy of Italy is, I think, something that is extremely new in this book. Is kind of stop thinking of discussing the concept and the notions and what we think personally of these characters felt or lived in their life, and look at what happened to the Italian civil institutions. And this was not only vis-à-vis the Jews, clearly, I mean, it was a progressive erosion of the civil society and of the social infrastructure.
Yes, but in 1934, Jung was appointed as finance minister.
But Jung was not Jewish, I'm sorry. Was Catholic for 2 generations, was baptized, and was certified by the Vatican. So I think that this story should not...
Well, it was interesting that Mussolini himself said,
sure.
Who else but a Jew is finance minister?
Well, that was part of the game. I mean, part of Mussolini's game was exactly to have a front that was relatively acceptable and safe, and felt safe for Jews. I mean, and felt safe for a large new middle class that had to feel some degree of comfort, along with the fear and the system of fear and privilege that we all know existed. I mean, the walls have ears is not something it has been something that continued into our generation. Anyway, but let's continue and leave the debate. I just wanted to add the part that to which you were responding. I'd like to invite Federico Finchelstein to.
Well, it's great. I mean, this might be one of those occasions in which we can have an actual debate among historians. I mean, let me start by saying that I actually disagree very respectfully with Professor Adler's position. I will return to this. In the meantime, I would like to say that basically, in that sense, actually, I tend to agree with the authors of the book, which actually they ask the question, why 1938 happened, and they try to explain it, as opposed to basically provide reasons in terms of why it shouldn't have happened. Because, I mean, all the data that Professor Adler provided is totally correct. And yet, that doesn't explain 1938 or basically Italian participation in the Holocaust. And moreover, actually, the radical conversion of fascism at large to a radical brand of anti-Semitism. And this is something that, as an historian, one sees not only in public reviews or journals, but also in private documents and private letters. There is a constant reference after 1938, almost a kind of new religious aspect of the fascist political religion, in which this kind of new dogma needs to be repeated. As I said, in private conversations, private letters, I mean, now the Jews are the new enemy. And the question is, of course, very complex. And the authors of the book, in many ways, try to address why basically it happened. Given this very, in a way, very different history to the history of Germany that Professor Adler cogently described, or to the history of France. Incidentally, you might know this anecdote that if we, I mean, a famous historian of fascism and the Holocaust basically said that if we could take the time machine to, let's say, 1910, the Belle Epoque, and we would tell someone from that epoch that basically there was finally a modern state decided to kill the entire Jews of Europe, probably that European interlocutor of ours would say, I cannot believe it, the French finally made it. Because basically, neither Germany was a highly anti-Semitic country by the end of the 19th century. A country basically in which one of the most important parties was the social democracy, and also a country in which Jews participated in political life. Of course, not with the, let's say, presence, or at least the let's say the notoriety in which certain Italian Jewish politicians basically occupy central positions of government. But even in the most famous case, basically Nazi Germany, 1933 is also a turning point and a break. The question for us is to basically address through, I mean, in the case of today, I will do this, through basically trying to think with the book, through the book, and after reading the book, basically why basically we had this break in Italy in 1938. In that sense, one should return to the issue of what fascism is. And fascism is many things. I mean, I will not define it for you here. I give a definition in my book, highly debatable as every definition. But if we have to say at least some key dimensions of fascism, basically they will certainly include a radical notion of the enemy. I mean, fascism cannot exist without an enemy. And 1938 is the moment in which basically fascism goes for a new enemy. So basically, if you think about the fascist mindset in that sense, although the history of anti-Semitism is quite lacking, it is not surprising, or it's not even difficult for a fascist to acquire a new enemy. It needs to basically be provided, I mean, as basically with the increasing let's say, totalitarianization of Italian life, it needs to be basically coming from the top, as many things, including basically the switch from abstract art to neoclassic art, or other things that came basically from the top. This also came from the top. What is actually surprising, I would say, is that basically why someone like Mussolini, who was quite an ideological person, but also a very strategic politician, will go for something that he knew, as we know from among other sources from the Chiano diaries, will go for something that he knew was, let's say, not politically popular. Because he knew that Italians will first not agree with this. And yet, as a matter of fact, when one deals with the histories of Nazism, I mean, as you know, they started killing the Jews in 1941, not in 1933. And also Hitler knew after the first boycott that this was quite unpopular. I mean, it's not that many Germans were anti-Semite. They were, but they didn't necessarily want their Jewish neighbors, which they disliked, to be killed. Quite an important distinction. So in a way, another interesting contrast and perhaps also commonality with the Nazi case. But in the Italian case, basically, as I was saying, Mussolini knew that this was not, let's say, popular. And yet he went for the ideological dimension of his thought and practice. Because in his mind this was right. Not because of a long history of anti-Semitism, but rather because of another, perhaps more important aspect of his idea of politics, of fascist politics. That is to say that basically, and this is suggested by some of the authors in the collection, I'm not saying this alone, as a matter of fact, identified with this new trend of historiography. But basically, by this time, by 1937, after the big, as you know, big success of I mean, basically the war with Ethiopia and the declaration of the empire, this was probably, and this is accepted by historians on all sides of the, I mean, basically from all sides, the declaration of the empire were the more, I mean, those were the years, 1935, specifically 1936, in which fascism received its moments of high disapproval. By 1937, we know that Mussolini thought that there was a sort of stagnation and that he needed a new radical turn. The same will happen, by the way, another unexplainable situation, which is similar to the issue of 1938 anti-Semitism, which is why they will enter the war, knowing the lack of Italian military capacity as well as the lack of support for entering the war in that population. Incidentally, Hitler in Munich was quite unhappy with Mussolini for trying to avert the possibility of a war, and to his dislike, not only Italians but Germans supported Mussolini. I mean, we know this from Nazi documents, the majority of Germans were quite happy that Germany was not entering the war. Eventually, when it entered the war, Mussolini knew that, I mean, because he knew this, but that basically, in order to fight a kind of sound war, being militarily prepared after the basically difficult travels that had emerged out of both the Ethiopian campaign, but also the Spanish campaign, the Italian participation in the Spanish Civil War. Basically, he knew that probably Italy would have to enter the war by 1943, 1944. And most of the members of his government agree with this military assessment. He did not deny it, but he basically thought that if he did not enter the war at that time, another turning point, similar to the racist campaign of 38, he will not basically be a powerful man. Now, this brings us to a basic element of fascist ideology, whereas power is not only, I mean, basically an expression of violence, but rather it is identified with violence. So basically, in Mussolini's conception, the more violent you are, the more powerful you are. So I mean, these ideologies, I mean, really made sense in terms of understanding fascist practice. Now, let me return to the book. I mean, this is my own take on the ongoing debate. But now, let me talk briefly about the book. How many minutes I have now? I have sometimes 20 minutes. I'm negotiating. Yes. Okay, good. So basically, let me first say that this really important book has a previous, in a way, a previous antecedent. I mean, this book, of course, is a history of the Holocaust in Italy. But, and in many ways, actually, it inaugurates a new school of historiography. I will return to this, but a little bit later. But also, basically, 3 of the editors, out of the 4 editors, have edited a previous collection, also published in Italian by UTET. And these editors are Traverso, Sulama, and Flores. They have edited a 4-volume collection on the history of the Shoah, in which basically sadly has not been translated, but it is certainly the most important up-to-date encyclopedia of the Holocaust that exists. I mean, not only in Italian, in every language. It includes the participation of all the most important historians in the field, from Germany, from Israel, from the US, and many other places. So this is basically, in a way, something that I really appreciate from my Italian colleagues, because as opposed to starting with the specific, they really started with the general. So they first basically created the best collection on the Holocaust that exists today. And then they went from that to create a new collection, more specifically related to the history of the Shoah in Italy. So, but, I mean, if one could have, for a summer perhaps, a very interesting summer of very close readings, if one could read those 4 volumes, counting probably, I mean, I don't know, 1,500 pages, plus these 2 volumes, counting to my, I mean, at least 1,000 pages, one will learn basically a lot. So this is the context, I mean, in which I would say what we historians call the historian's workshop, right? This is the context of emergence, of production of this new war. Now, before entering the war itself, I would like to say a couple of things about Italian historiography. Italian historiography occupies a very unique role in history at large. I mean, basically, it is a very peripheral role. The majority of historians in the centers of production, I mean, the US, the main centers of production, the US, France, Germany, and so on, do not read Italian. But as opposed to those historians, basically Italian historians read many of all those languages. So basically when you read a book in Italian, what you have is not only, let's say, a book that participates of the very rich Italian tradition of historiography, but also a book that basically displays a dialogue that you don't find in other countries. Generally in French historiography, some people might read a little bit of English or a lot of English, and they might even sometimes participate of a dialogue with English-speaking historiographies. Whereas in Italian books, and this collection is an example of that, you have authors that are knowledgeable, I mean, of many bodies of historiographies in different countries. And this is not a small thing if you want to study the Holocaust. One of the most important historians of the Holocaust, Yehuda Bauer, once observed the difficulties in analyzing the Holocaust without knowing at least 9 or 10 languages. And then he highlighted that he knew many of them. I mean, the thing is, this is a global phenomenon in which many nations participated, there is an incredible amount of documents in many languages. So by default, we cannot, I mean, the majority of us, engage with the history of the Holocaust at large. So this is, I mean, as in the work of a single author. So in a way, Italian historians are generally, let's say, open to learning about other historiographies, much more open than other historiographers, I would say, and especially because, in a way, in a certain way, and I don't mean this disrespectfully, but academically, in a way, Italian is a sort of prison, in the sense that nobody reads you, and you have to read other historiographies if you want to, know the world. But this is a great blessing. This is a great blessing. I mean, I'm from Argentina, and we generally have this contrast with Brazilians. I mean, they know many languages, and we just speak Spanish and perhaps English, because our language is also spoken in many places. So anyway, and this place, I mean, is quite old. I mean, you can go back to someone like Croce or Momigliano, and then more recently to Carlo Ginzburg or Enzo Traverso. I mean, to know how basically these extremely influential historians have participated of many historiographical traditions at the same time. So I will use a very colloquial metaphor. I'm a big fan of tennis, and this will be someone like basically Federer, who plays in all sorts of surfaces. So anyway, this is the tradition of Italian historiography that I wanted to highlight, both an insider and an outsider to other historiographical trends. In parentheses, I will say it would be fantastic if this work could be translated into English. I know it will be a huge task, but it will be really, really fantastic for a variety of reasons that I will now explain. That is to say, why I believe this work is very important. As a matter of fact, as opposed to the first encyclopedia, the majority of the collaborators in this collection are Italians. And this could be constructed perhaps as a mild criticism. I mean, why other historians working on Italy were not included, but as a matter of fact, I will not make that criticism. Actually, I'm happy that the majority of these historians are Italians. Why? Because other authors working in other languages, actually they have a broader public than Italian historians publishing and working in Italian. So it's really great to finally have this collection of the main players in Italy. And it's truly a collection of the main players. It really represents a kind of aggiornamento of Italian historiography. Why? Because quite simply, and the title of this meeting is quite telling, quite symptomatic of a larger problem. I mean, basically, historians, we have been dealing with a myth. The myth of the good Italian, the myth that Italy had nothing whatsoever to do with the Holocaust, the myth that basically there was no relation between Italian fascism and Nazism, or as an historian that was quite instrumental in both creating Italian historiography on fascism, but also, that is really good, and now the bad, in silencing basically Italian fascist connections with racism and the Holocaust. And this book, this collection shows that that was not the case. And it shows that with both a very subtle combination of interpretation and facts. I mean, there are facts, data basically, to show that. Basically, De Felice famously said that Italy was outside the shadow of the Holocaust, which is a very curious statement insofar as, in many ways, it was inside, including Italian citizens being bystanders, but also perpetrators and victims. Which brings me to one of the main innovations of this collection, which in a way correlates to what has been going on in Holocaust historiography at large. Believe it or not, it's only until relatively recently that historians of the Holocaust have started to emphasize the centrality of the victims as sources. Originally, roughly from the 1940s to perhaps even the 1990s or the late 1980s, in Holocaust historiography, historians of the victims were doing Jewish history, not Holocaust history, and Holocaust historians were dealing with the perpetrators, as if their sources were the only source of knowledge. With works such as the work of Saul Friedlander and many others, that has basically changed. So victims now occupy a central role in a history that had them, sadly, in a central role. And this innovation is also basically central in this collection. So basically, we not only hear about perpetrators here, but also we hear about the Jews, and they have a central role, and we hear about not only the Jews in Italy, but also the Jews in exile. Incidentally, that is in my opinion, a path-breaking chapter by Enzo Traverso. And we also learn about a variety of things that I will briefly mention in 2 minutes. But before that, I mean, I wanted actually, I thought that I wanted to, I mean, before listening to his presentation, I wanted to, I came here prepared to disagree actually with Professor Adler, because I read his fantastic and review, the best so far in my opinion, of this collection, which is not a small or an easy task, because I mean, to review this book, I relate. I mean, I have been thinking about this for this presentation. So I mean, it's a very respectful, analytic, and criticism of the collection. And one of the questions that Professor Adler asked in his review, or suggests, is whether this collection presents a new interpretation. And on a certain level, I agree with his answer, that is no. But also I wanted to push the question a little bit more, to ask it again, basically. Because, I mean, of course, it's difficult to have, I mean, and I would agree with Professor Adler, I mean, basically when you read the roughly 1,000-something pages that this book is about, basically you understand that all these voices do not agree on many topics. And actually that makes it, in my opinion, more interesting, because then it's the challenge also for the reader to integrate these different views and to do the best. Basically, we expect readers of history to do, which is provide their own interpretation. So you choose among different interpretations, among different sets of that data, and eventually this is your own interpretation. So basically, if you ask that question in that way, I mean, basically, in a way, forcing the question. Forcing a question that has a clear answer, that is no. But then if you ask it again, can I see an overall approach which states something new? I mean, notwithstanding all the particular differences. And in a way, in that sense, I will be tempted to say yes. Because you learn about many things. And the new approach, I mean, on a certain level is in a way a very simple answer. 2 minutes, perfect. I'm almost there. So basically, one is that before we didn't have a body of work emphasizing the central role of Italy in the Holocaust. But in a way, that is not, I mean, that is right and it's not. Because this book basically presents this new view, which has basically taken 20 years to become what I think now is the mainstream of Italian historiography. And in my opinion, happily so. Basically that now, as opposed to, for example, the US, in Italy it is quite accepted that anti-Semitism had a central role both before and after 1938. And then another issue that, well, I have also raised, I was thinking about talking about this issue of conversion and fascism violence, but I have already mentioned this, so I will skip this part of the presentation. And then there are different levels in which we can see basically a new interpretation. And the one level that we see a new interpretation, perhaps the most spectacular or yeah, I would say spectacular of all of them, is this idea that 1938 is not that much of a break. I mean, and that is a new interpretation, and most of the authors tend to agree with this point, although their explanation is very different. Another new thing that comes to mind, particularly when dealing with older historiographical approaches such as the Felice, is that most of these historians agree that there was not that much of Nazi pressure to do the racist laws. So they may have, actually many authors say this, they may have imitated a lot of stuff from the Nazis, even asking them for advice and support. But the Nazis did not pressure Italians into put these laws into place. These laws emerged from Mussolini's mind as the idea of the need to basically force, as these are his words, force Italians to be real men by engaging in this new violence against this new enemy. The war that came 1 year later, as I said, is part of that new, let's say, leaning in fascism. And finally, so basically the Nazi influence is not that important. And this was, I mean, this is a new interpretation, which again, the book basically presents in the voices of many authors, and this is the new paradigm that has been going on, Sarfati being one of the first. I incidentally will say that even before Sarfati, the work of the Israeli historian Meir Michaelis, I mean, presented such a view. I mean, and that is something that is acknowledged in one of the essays by Donofrio, and perhaps it could be acknowledged a little bit more. So to end here, to end, I will say that the book has presents a new, much critical gaze to think Italian and European modernity. That it presents at least 4 different novel aspects. It addresses the longue durée, the long history of European violence with the Holocaust as an event, and how it is related to Italian history. Starting with the fantastic analysis by someone like Sulam on the illiberal trends in the Risorgimento. Finally, it presents, and this is not, I mean, this is quite important in Italian historiography, it presents a new school of Italian Jewish studies, which was quite an important before. So we can now know that, I mean, that Italian historians have a school of Jewish studies. And finally, it brings Italian historiography, and this is the second volume of the collection, to study the longue durée, not only in terms of its beginnings, but also in terms of its aftermath, because the second volume is about what happens after 1945, and it has fantastic essays on the law, basically on TV, neo-Nazism and Holocaust denial, the Holocaust and the left, and a very interesting, in my opinion, brilliant essay by Antonio Cariotti on the links between neo-fascism and anti-Semitism. And here I would like to end with Silvio Berlusconi. Because basically, he shows how there is a history in neo-fascism and the right, more generally, to basically de-emphasize or even deny the central dimensions and the centrality of the experience of the Holocaust to fascism, as if this is a small parenthesis or a small footnote. But you have to remember that this ran basically many years, from 1938 to the end of the war. This is also fascism, and it's a big part of the experience of fascism, and incredibly so, the majority of the participants of the Italian neo-fascism, from the MSI to the Alleanza Nazionale, basically the ones that lived fascism, this was their fascism, the most extreme fascism that existed. Basically, eventually the fascism of Salò. And when Berlusconi basically minimizes the role of Mussolini in the Holocaust, and even tries to empathically understand the alliance of Mussolini with Hitler, he's trying to return to exactly the myth that this collection is, with facts, showing as a myth. So I would like to finish with this thought only. Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Professor Finchelstein. The book is, the collection touches on another point that has caused heated debates and is another main reductionist question. And this is the role of the Catholic Church in Italian anti-Semitism. The book has a number of articles on anti-Semitism before fascism, during the first decade of fascism, and on the latter, of course, on the treaty that in 1929 brought back the Catholic Church as the official religion of Italy, thus relegating all other religion to be tolerated cults, and on the role of the Church during the racial laws and the Italian Social Republic. We have here one of the contributors of this series of essays, Susan Zuccotti, who I believe is one of the most respected experts in the study of the Church and the Holocaust. And please welcome.
Thank you very much. It's very nice to be here, and I'm very pleased and proud to be associated with this fabulous publication. I also feel a little bit awkward because I am asking you as an audience to shift your attention and your thoughts to a subject which is rather different from what we've been discussing before. And what has been presented to you before. So I think it is an indication of the breadth and width and depth of this publication, but it is a little bit jarring perhaps for you to go from hearing and thinking and considering about anti-Semitism, fascism, the longue durée, into something much more specific, which was my particular article. I've been thinking as I've been listening that, of course, all of the articles were specific in their way. It's too bad, I think, that we didn't have to present to you a table of contents, which would have given you a sense of the variety of the articles, because mine otherwise sounds very different. My article was preceded by an article by Liliana Picciotto-Fagion about rescue and assistance to Jews in Italy during the Salo period, during the German occupation, so that mine is not the only one. And this volume, as I hope, well, there are two volumes, but these volumes are incredibly broad in the subjects that they address and the focuses that they provide. So my article was entitled, I will give you just a brief description of it. Time does not permit more, but my article was entitled Il Vaticano, la Chiesa e il salvataggio degli ebrei in Italia. The Vatican, the Church, and the rescue of Jews in Italy. I did not treat rescue Jews in general because, as I said, Liliana Picciotto-Fagion had done that. And so I made it my task to try to analyze the responses, the response primarily of, well, I guess responses, the various responses of Pius XII to the persecution of the Jews, not at the time of the racial laws, but actually at the time of the German occupation. I provided in my article a very brief description of Eugenio Pacelli, his personality, his personal views. I discuss his role as Secretary of State very briefly I discussed very briefly his role as Secretary of State during the papacy of Pius XI. And I then I discuss his commitment once the war broke out to a position, his very firm commitment to a position of neutrality among the Allies, with the exception of the Soviet Union. In other words, he tried not to appear to be on the side of either the German, Austrian contingent or the Western Allies. Having said that, in my article, somewhat briefly, I tried to discuss in more detail the three various ways in which Pius XII could have been useful, helpful to the Jews in Italy, and what he did, what he could have done, and what in fact he did do. The three fields of response that I try to explore include public pronouncements, diplomatic interventions, and actual involvement in the rescue of Jews in Italy itself. This is a vast subject about which I've written a much more lengthy book, and so it was difficult to put it together into a short article. I was pleased with what came out, but it's even more difficult to present it to you in the space of 10 minutes. So about public pronouncements, in other words, what did the Pope say about the ongoing persecution of the Jews after 1943? Again, I don't talk about the racial laws from the very beginning, although I do a little bit. This is very difficult to summarize, but in a few words, summarizing, I would say that it's not a question of either all or nothing. It's not true that Pius said nothing. It's not true. It is also obviously true that he never condemned the deportations and persecutions of the Jews. What he did in the various speeches that I try to describe in the article are occasional references to the unity of the human race and the need for all of contemporaries to show mercy and compassion for those who were suffering as a result of the war. There were no statements that used the word Jew. There were no statements which referred to National Socialist persecution of the Jews. There were a few references to papal compassion for those who were suffering because of nationality and descent, or however you wish to translate the word stirpe, which means the descent or background, and has often been translated as race. The Pope did not use the word race or religion in his statements of compassion for those who were suffering from the war. Those were the papal pronouncements. They would include Summi Pontificatus in October of 1939, a very well-known speech in December 1942, a Christmas message, a speech in June of 1943, and another in June of 1944. It's a question of judgment. It was certainly, in the eyes of most of us, not enough. It is also, I think, probably fair to say that those who wanted to hear words from the Pope in support of support they were giving to the Jews believed that they heard it. Those who wished to give no support to Jews, those who were firmly anti-Semitic and committed to the persecution of the Jews, also heard no denunciation of their position. I'm summarizing so much that I feel uncomfortable about whether I'm actually making this all clear and getting it to you without too much generalization, but I'm trying. The second field in which, aspect in which the Pope could be helpful to the Jews was through diplomatic interventions. And this is a subject that I certainly cannot go into in detail, because it's so technical. But I think if you read the history, particularly a fine book by Father John Morley called Vatican Diplomacy and the Jews, in which he studies the publications of the 11 volumes of Vatican publications and traces he studies the 11 volumes of Vatican publications of Vatican diplomatic documents dating to the war years. And he presents what he feels were the various Vatican diplomatic steps and interventions on behalf of Jews in various countries: Croatia, Germany, France, Slovakia, Italy, Hungary, although Hungary is not treated in Father Morley's book. And I think I do this also in my book about Under His Very Windows in far great, and also in the article. So I won't go into it too much here, except to say that for the most part, there were occasional expressions from diplomats representing the Holy See to the Germans, the French, and more frequently Italian diplomats, in which the Holy See expressed its concern and made it clear that it was watching the events, was aware of the events, was aware of the deportations, and was concerned. Those interventions, for the most part, were mild, polite, somewhat late in the process, and again, for the most part, quite ineffective. Again, I think one can say that those who wanted to hear could say, yes, the Vatican is watching. And Italian diplomats particularly, involved in German demands for the deportation of Jews from Italian-occupied Croatia, from southern Greece, from southeastern France, may well have heard or been aware of papal concern. But we can't say much more than that, and that is really not saying a great deal. The final and most complicated question, and I promised I was going to be brief, and now I'm not being brief, but the final question that I discussed in my article was papal involvement in the rescue of Jews. And that certainly is the most important question of all. It's also the most intangible, the most difficult to get a handle on, because we know what the Pope said publicly. Obviously, it was public. We can find it out. We know the diplomatic intervention. They may have been inadequate, but we know what there was. It's hard to argue about it. You might argue about judgment in the papal pronouncements, about efficacy or promptness in the diplomatic interventions, but we can't argue about what was done because it was public. It's very hard with papal involvement in a rescue because by definition it was clandestine. I suggest in my article that there was very little papal involvement in rescue, that the Pope's philosophy, and he expressed it on numerous occasions, was that each bishop or archbishop in his own diocese should make the decision for himself about what to do, what kind of guidance to give his priests, if any at all, and that the prelates made those decisions accordingly. There's very little evidence of any kind of involvement from the Vatican in rescue in any country other than Italy. And there is almost none, in fact, and there's almost no evidence of papal involvement in rescue of Jews in Italy itself outside of the city of Rome. The city of Rome was the most complex case. It's the most elusive, and it's the most contentious. It's interesting that most of the claims that the Pope did give a directive for opening monasteries and convents, most of the claims of a papal directive have been made quite recently. Virtually nothing in the early post-war years. Individuals very involved in rescue of Jews, priests, Don Francesco Repetto, Cassini in Florence, Père Marie Benoit in Rome, all denied any kind, or didn't mention. But Padre Maria Benedetto actually denied any kind of papal influence because he was pressed to do so. He was asked, and he said, no, the Vatican was not involved in my work. Fathers Repetto and Cassini in Florence and Genoa wrote books about their rescue efforts, never mentioning a papal role. I can go on about evidence, and it's complicated, but the fact remains that for the city of Rome, there are claims being made. Few, not many, and most are not particularly credible, either because they have come so late, often from nuns who would have been very young at the time, and when I'm actually making it sound as if there are so many, there are really only about 3. 3 or 4 at the most. And one of them, a written testimony, is obviously backdated to make it look as if it was a chronicle written at the time. And this is simply not evidence. What I believe happened is that in Rome, particularly, individual priests and prelates may be related by marriage to various Jews who had friends, the kinds of friendships that we've heard about tonight, the kinds of relationships with friends or business or teachers or mentors. Those priests and prelates took various individuals under their protection. Some were Jews, some were political dissenters, some were anti-fascists of one kind or another, and tried to find places, refuges for them. This happened, and certainly some of the beneficiaries were Jews, and certainly a large number of Jews did hide in institutions of the church in Rome. No question about it. But it was an informal, I argue, an informal procedure, a very personal procedure, and the Pope undoubtedly knew, did not prevent, occasionally gave permission. One testimony we have from the head of the Fate Bene Fratelli Hospital in Rome was a monk who has said, we wrote to the Vatican telling them we were taking in Jews, we never got an answer, we assumed it was fine. And that's a written testimony. And this was a major place, one of the larger refuges. I think that's the way it worked for the most part, and that is what I try to suggest in my article a little bit more clearly, perhaps, than I've been able to do in a short time here. Thank you.
We have an interview with Zuccotti on our latest issue of Written Matter, the online monthly on our website. And I invite all of you to read it. It's very interesting. We have, as I said, another guest, Roberta Ascarelli, who contributed an essay on women's memoir. Now, I only learned yesterday that she was in the States, so of course there is no time to prepare a presentation, and so but I invited her anyway to take part in the roundtable and the discussion. But I'll ask you to welcome her. And I will begin to have questions from the ends. Okay. Now, first of all, before we open the questions to questions from the audience, I'd like to say a few things about I will ask a few questions to our speakers. I will begin from Roberta Ascarelli because exactly because she's a guest whom we have invited only at the last minute. And I'll ask her to say a few things on the essay that she presented in the
So thank you so much for your invitation. If I speak Italian, how many people can understand? No. Only you. Okay, I will try to speak in English. We'll see what happens. I am a German scholar. So that means that they asked me to write an essay about the memoirs of Italian women. And that could be a sign of the procedures they have trying to organize the book. I think the book is a very important one because, as have you heard, the word that comes often is why. So, and the book doesn't want to respond to answer the question, but doesn't want to put other questions and push you to try to find connection between the articles and push you to find your own way in a rich amount of materials and ideas. I was asked to write about Italian women. I didn't know anything about Italian women. I'm a German scholar, so I do memoirs of German women. I did a lot about the issue, about the topic, and I had to discover that it was totally another way of present themselves to get in touch with gender problems, with the past, with the future. The other thing was very important, and that to understand the memoirs of the women in Italy, you had to deal with the situation after the Second World War. So you have to understand what was the situation that could be very oppressive to women, because they couldn't express a personal experience without dealing with the idea that you have to fight against fascism. You have to take your position. You have to be. You cannot speak about your life, your experience. You have only to present yourself as a fighter. And the other way, it was really complicated because so only the partigiani had the possibilities to express themselves, to write about them, to present themselves as the beginners a new life in Italy. On the other hand, they had the problem that in Italy, what did you do in the camps? What kind of experience you had? It was really a great suspicion about the behavior of women, so they couldn't express themselves. And in the first reviews about the literature of memoirs, of camp, and so on, it was a silence, a total silence about women. And that was, even though 5 women wrote memoirs immediately after the war, in 1945 and 1946. And they tried to express themselves, but they were trying to think about what can that mean for a woman in Italy. So I think, I don't know how my essay is, but it was for me a very interesting experience of research and of writing, because you could see how the situation after the war was for women and for gender problems and for identities, for memoirs, such an obstacle to say the truth. And what kind of opposition they had to deal with, speaking, thinking about themselves, the past, in the new situation. Only one thing, as I told to you before, I don't agree with you. I think so that much. When you say that the book doesn't speak enough about the progress of fascism, I think it's a big effort to put in the book a lot of perspectives about fascism, anti-fascism, about Shoah, and about future. So I think that the book doesn't want to be so to be syncretic. It tries to be very open to perspectives and theoretical perspectives. Okay. And I think that you can find a lot inside. A lot.
Not a single essay.
Sure.
Not a single essay on the relationship between fascism.
Yeah, but you can find in the essays a lot of things, that there is a dialogue between the essays. I don't think they want to do a book about fascism. They try to understand how fascism and Shoah has something, or more than something to do, and I think they succeed in that. You don't think so? Thank you.
I'm so glad you invited Professor Adler. Otherwise, I would have bored. So, let's just say one more thing. This book, and I too disagree, you know, contains what this book presents, and what I think is a value that is very important for new scholars and for students and for colleagues here in the United States, is that a very large part of the documents, of the archival documents that are presented through these essays were not available to the Felice, and were hardly available to Sukhothi. I mean, we have a new generation of historians who had access to Italian public archives, to archives of the police system that were made available only in the past 15 years. And the view that we have through this material is unprecedented in this way. And I think that's another element that makes this work important. And again, I think that the description of how the fascism modified the Italian society intrinsically leads to understand how racial persecution fell into it. Now I won't speak anymore, and I will read the questions that have come from the audience. One is for Dr. Zuccotti. How did the fear of the invasion of the Vatican by the Nazis affect Vatican policy?
There are microphones. Can you say that again?
How did the fear of the invasion of the Vatican by the Nazis affect Vatican policy?
Pius XII made it very clear that he was prepared to be a martyr, to close down the Vatican, to be taken into captivity. He made statements such as that to his colleagues, but I think the fear of an invasion was certainly there. In the early days of the German occupation of Rome, we can trace that measures by which the Vatican diplomats tried to negotiate with the Germans to get assurances that there would be no invasion of the Vatican, that the Vatican would be permitted to continue to function. So it was certainly something that was on the minds of everyone involved. I'm not sure that it was the most important factor in papal decisions about what to do vis-a-vis the persecution of the Jews. I think there were other motives, possibly more determinative, such as the commitment to neutrality, the desire to be involved in negotiation of a possible peace between the Germans and the Western Allies, a fear of alienating the Germans, the German people and German soldiers in particular, by a statement against the Holocaust. It's very complicated. The fear, the concern about encouraging a Bolshevik victory, but most of all, also the concern to not endanger Jews who were hiding in Catholic institutions was a factor as well. I think the main factor, though, was the fear, not so much, but the concern that a complete break would mean that the church would be unable to function in relation to Catholics all over the world, so that communications would have been shut down, and the bureaucracy and the church would not be able to fulfill the mission that Pius XII gave most primacy to, which was to be there to minister to the needs of Catholics all over the world.
Thank you. What was the difference between Italian camps and Eastern European camps? I don't know if any of you wants to answer.
Well, the Italian camps were largely holding facilities for Jews who then would be the Frank Sinatra model, like the new Met production of Rigoletto. The Italian camps were largely holding facilities for Jews who then would be transported to the camps. They weren't anything like Auschwitz, a labor camp or anything like that.
Can you explain Feramonti, please?
Hmm?
Can you explain to the audience Feramonti?
Please write the questions down and yes.
Veramonte is a bit different. That's what we do know more about that camp, and that's interesting because it was largely self-administered. And an interesting relationship between the inmates in the camp, the administration, and the townspeople surrounding that camp. But that certainly wasn't typical of the camps in Germany or Poland either.
Well, I would, just to clarify, I would say that there were about 68 camps, internment camps, that the fascist regime added to its internment locations that had existed since the 1920s. This happened in 1940 and was only to detain foreign Jews who were in Italy. Who were the foreign Jews? In Italy were Jews who had arrived from Northern and Eastern Europe prior to, largely prior to 1940, largely between 1935 and 1939. And Italian Jews who had lost, would be stripped of their citizenship because they had acquired it after 1919. These camps were internment camps. People were large, mostly we know from the protests, the international complaints, the reports of the Red Cross, not nice places. We have a famous report, a protest against the camp of Campania, in which suddenly 340 people were thrown overnight. The local prefect, to receive funds, had declared that could hold 900 people. The camp could hardly host 100 people. And so there was a protest. It was supported by De La Sem, was supported by several international entities, until half of it was closed. We know that they had one latrine for 340 people. We know that they had no heat. They had hardly any type of hygienic facility, and and most of the Feramonti was no better. Nobody wanted to, of course, to go to Feramonti. It was a place with malaria, like Campania. It was a place where people were deprived of all their rights, their basic, besides their freedom, but their basic needs as human beings. So we have letters from inmates of these camps that are devastating. Of course, after the war, when people learned about Auschwitz, the statements of inmates were very different. People look at Auschwitz, and even though they had a very difficult experience, described their experience in the Italian camps, as rather positive. That is very different from what we have in the letters of that time during their internment. The other thing, so these were the camps that were set up by the regime. After 1943, most of the camps in the south, by September 19th, 1943, the camps are liberated by the Allies. These are the largest, camps where Jews were detained in Italy, closed and became displaced personnel camps by September 1943. The camps in the center and north of Italy were expanded. Several provincial camps were created as transit places to Auschwitz and other Eastern European camps. These camps were largely managed with an Italian infrastructure and under German control. But as Lina Picciotto showed very clearly in her book on Fossoli, she ends the book asking, how can so many people who served the camp, vendors, local citizens, local villagers, people who worked for the functioning of the camp, never wonder how, who were these women, men, elderly people, children, who were shipped in a train on a daily basis. And by now, maybe in Italy, it was known that they were going to death.
Just briefly, I would like to add to the question that basically there were only a few extermination centers, which is a particular variety of the camps, and these were located in a few places in Eastern Europe. For the rest of Europe, including the rest of Eastern Europe, what you had is different sort of transit or labor camps. So the most famous camps, such as Auschwitz, were part of a very small number of camps which became extermination centers. So in that sense, Italy is not different to the rest of Europe, including the rest of Eastern Europe.
Yeah, I want to add that Italy had its extermination camps with gas chambers and crematoria in Trieste, where a very large section of the Jews residing in the northeast of Europe were murdered. I don't know if I need to add anything else. Are there any other questions?
Did you say, did I understand or misunderstand that in Trieste there was an extermination?
Downtown, imagine that you have a camp, an extermination camp with a chimney at the Chelsea Pier. That's what it is. That's how the Risiera is at Trieste. A functioning extermination camp in a city that had the highest rate of collaboration in Italy, along with Fiume and other cities in the surrounding where anti-Semitism had been stronger and the racial laws were applied in a more...
the name of the camp.
The Risiera di San Saba.
And that also had an Italian infrastructure.
Was created by the German occupiers. That area had become part of the so-called Adriatic littoral. Was run by Germans, but had a very strong collaboration among Italians. The trial for the Risiera di San Saba was concluded, I believe, in 1982, exactly because of the enormous rate of collaboration among the population. And it was buried for years and years until most of the people have died.
I was just at your last event, which was about Ethiopia and part of this series. And I'm interested, especially those of you who were talking about Mussolini wanting the other and wanting to make men out of his soldiers and his people, whether you can draw any connections between what the Italians did in Ethiopia and whether some of the same bureaucrats, some of the same soldiers, or not. I'm curious whether there's any connection at all, or whether the only connection is really on the top.
I think Professor Finchelstein.
Just briefly, the book, I mean, this is something that that the book, I mean, I should have mentioned if I didn't. Now I don't recall basically if I mentioned that. But basically the book, in a way, represents another and yet another dimension of new Italian developments in historiography, because basically it definitely connects the experience of empire in Ethiopia and the racism that came with it, and particularly the essay, the chapter, great chapter by Lavanca, by Italian historian Lavanca, on this issue. Because basically what you see is that, yes, in 1938 there were racist laws against the Jews, but in the empire in Ethiopia you had basically racism going on legally against the natives. So basically racism in Italy started with black Ethiopians and then engulfed the Jews. So it's basically a very strong connection. Now another question which is also interesting is to compare what is different between, let's say, Italian fascist colonial practices and the practices of non-fascist Italy, the previous practices of non-fascist Italy. And here is also an interesting situation, because you have many ruptures, right, in which basically the fascist colonial powers acted in a much more aggressive way and eventually a racist way towards basically the citizens that were dominated by the Italian Empire. So that is one connection. Other connections in North Africa are equally important. In terms also of concentration and killings of civilians. So that is also that is a very important. I thank you for the question. It is a central issue.
Prior to the passing the racial laws, Mussolini negotiates with the envoy of Pope Pius XI on their tenor, and one has a sense reading the text that it's sort of a game of cat and mouse. But the Pope did not really raise any major problem, and one wonders whether the concern about the Vatican's role in the Holocaust really it focuses on Pius XII mistakenly. It seems to be a tradition that is carried on.
It's a pity that
this is very hot in Italy, sort of the War of the Popes, because Benedict opened up the Vatican's secret archives up until the year 1939. And one of the things that's fascinated the Italian public is how strong Pius XI was in his reaction to Mussolini. He said, referring to the new racial policy, he makes me ashamed not only as Pope, but as an Italian. There were splits. It's clear that Pius XI wanted to take did take a very forthright, but Pacelli did not. The head of the Jesuit order did not. Pius XI had commissioned an encyclical. John Lafarge, who was an American priest, who had written a good article on racism in the United States. That encyclical was finished at the time Pius XI died. It was on his night table, and the kibosh was put on it. It never surfaced. One analytic point that I think Catholic scholars are weak on, it goes like this. The church wasn't anti-Semitic because they see anti-Semitism as being racial. And it was the universal commitment of the church, no, we're not. They said the church is guilty of anti-Judaism, which was not a racial, but a religious type of thing. What falls in between that is, from roughly the 1870s on, a whole host of resentments that you can find in Civiltà Cattolica, which was the Jesuit publication, dealing with Jews and obscure relationships, first with Masons and then communists. Jews as agents of modernism. Jews, things that were not connected directly either to race or religion, but these resentments. Now, there is some suggestion that Pius XI, toward the end, was starting to rethink the anti-Judaism. If that were so, it did not carry over into Pius XII. Too bad you were out of the room. We're on our hobby horse, and I was mentioning the new literature.
Yes.
By the way, David Kurtzer is coming out with a book soon on this that probably will be a blockbuster.
Why do they negotiate a treaty in '33 with Hitler? The Concordat. Why?
That's 29.
No, with
Hitler.
Oh, with Hitler.
Why the rush?
I can't. Why didn't you deal with that?
I'm trying to remember the reason for the rush, but as I recall, the Germans made an overture to Pius XI, and he thought that this was his moment. I mean, it was done very quickly. I think it was signed in July. Hitler, of course, came to power in January of 1933. But as I recall, the Germans, there were some kind of a diplomatic opening, and they thought that they should seize it. The reasons for the Concordat with Germany were not that the church was approving Nazism, but it was hoping to guarantee the safety of Catholic institutions in Germany and protect them from Nazi advances, Nazi aggression. And to work out a system by which those Catholic institutions could continue to exist, schools in particular, but churches and parishes as well, which felt threatened by the Nazis. And as you undoubtedly know, this was not a necessarily successful, but a successful step. But Pius XI and Pius XII both were diplomats who were very much of the persuasion that you make agreements to try to solidify relationships, diplomatic relationships.
Okay, we will continue this discussion during other programs, so I'll take two more questions very quickly.
A bit of history. Hitler famously once said, "After all, who remembers the Armenian massacres?" And about a year or two ago, there was a wonderful exhibit in the Casa, Italiana, dedicated to an Italian, Pietro Brazza, for whom Brazzaville in the Congo is named. And he was an Italian administrator who worked with the Belgians in the Belgian Congo. And in the decade before World War I, it's estimated that some 10 million Congolese were tortured and exterminated.
No, Brazza worked for the French, not for the Belgian. Stanley was with the Belgian.
Well,
Brazza was with... No. There are two different Congos.
Well,
Brazzaville is the capital of former French Congo, and that's where Brazza was involved with.
But he tried to save them, so how did he...
And the king were a different story.
Okay, let's keep it topical, please, because you had...
Just, I was wondering, when you were talking about camps, the camp is equal to Judaica, or the Judaica came after?
The Judaica is a medieval thing, it has nothing to do with...
Do you know why? In my hometown, I read the book about Nicastro, that it's this small town.
Right.
Now it's La Mezzia Terme, it's an international airport also there. But Nicastro had this Judaica, in a part of Nicastro. And I was wondering, Judaica, so it's before the...
No, Judaicas are, in fact, they're Jewish quarters. They precede the ghetto area.
No, Judaica.
The camps are prisons, are places where people are taken by the police, arrested, and interned and have no freedom. That's what they are, the prisons.
But Judaicas, you say they were groups of Jewish people.
It's a Jewish quarter.
Yeah, but before the Nazis
much. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, there was another episode. I mean, there was a long era of segregation of the Jews in Italy, which was imposed by the papal state on the Jews, which were the ghettos. The ghettos were forced segregations. There were different times. They changed depending on the pope. Some were harsher, some were not as harsh. But there was another, it's another era. Here we're talking about, the fascist era. And the form of segregation we have are the times. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you.